I was a little too old when it came out. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Their new EP is very, very good. It's very good to listen to when you weightlift. I'm trying to think. Itch for the Cure. Itch for the Cure. I could listen to that all day long. All right, I'm assuming it's going to start. I don't want to hear my voice. Really quick, though, I want to show you all something now that we are recording. So before we get started lecturing today, your first exam posted at 12 o'clock this morning and is due. It is due next week. It is due next Friday. But I posted a couple of other things. Not that. I didn't post that, and you don't get to see that. So we go into the lecture notes. If you notice, I've got a brand new study guide for the multiple choice questions. We are going to schedule, probably on Monday, we're going to schedule a review session. It will probably be either on Wednesday or Thursday evening of next week. If you can't make it, I will record a session for you. So 35 multiple choice questions. They are selected from a pool, which means that you may not get the same questions as other people, and you may not necessarily get them in the exact same order. Your essay questions will also be due then. It's 30 points. The exam will be 100 points total. I gave you an extra 10 to 15 minutes on the time limit. And it's open book and it is open note. You're not going to have but do take some time to prepare because you only get to take it once. And if you're looking up stuff in the book for every question because you didn't study, you're not going to finish in time. And you definitely want to finish. So the study guide is here. It will have everything that you need. Anything that is on here is fair game. Anything that's not on here, I'm not going to test you on it. So remember, no tricks. Tricks are for kids and rabbits. Okay, so let's take a look at our take-home essay questions because you can start working on some of these right now, or at least later this week. So now some of these we have not covered, but some of these we are going to cover today and Monday. So discuss 3 ways that drugs produce agonistic effects and 3 ways that they produce antagonistic effects. We will get there. That is probably one of the last things we'll cover. So you can start looking now if you want, but I'd say for this one, you might be better advised to wait. Provide specific examples for full credit. You need an example for each of the ways that a drug can serve as an agonist and each of the ways that a drug can work as an antagonist. 6 examples total. Folks, you don't have to write a lot for this one. I just want examples. Here we have a graph. Describe and explain how 4 ionic events contribute to the typical action potential. Label the 4 arrows in this illustration with the event. Be thorough in your response and describe the action potential sequence in full. Just labeling the figure will result in partial credit. Then finally, I have a picture of a neuron. Use the accompanying figure to summarize how signals are conducted and transmitted through a multipolar neuron. To complement your summary, indicate on the illustration where the various events occur. You need 5 different events minimum. I think there are only 5 here, so just give me 5 events. And here's the deal. If it makes sense to me, I give partial credit and I'm pretty generous with it. If you're writing something about unicorns just for the sake of writing something, I cannot in good conscience give that extra credit. So do keep that in mind. I give extra credit, but it does have to be, or not extra credit, but partial credit. It has to be reasonable. But we might also have some other partial extra credit on the horizon as well. Maybe. I don't joke about these things. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, we are on lecture 5, I think. Come on, hurry up. We got things to do. Okay, yes. So the last time we were here, we were talking about our good friend, the spinal cord. I will get my head out of the way. So the spinal cord basically runs kind of in the opposite direction that the brain does, in terms that the outside of the brain is gray matter The inside of the brain is white matter. Here, we've got the reverse. The outside of the spinal cord is made up of myelinated axons, that white matter, and then our gray matter are the cell bodies, and those are on the inside. Like the brain, we are going to have our 3 meninges covering the spinal cord. And one of the things that you will notice is that even though the spinal nerves do eventually fuse, we do have separate regions for sensory processing, such as the touches or sensations that we feel in our skin, and motor regions. So the dorsal root ganglion is for sensory information. The ventral root is for motor information. And then both of those are going to fuse together in the spinal nerve. While you are writing, I get fuel. I know the first step of a problem is admitting that you have a problem. Don't care. Thirsty and it tastes good. Okay, so one of the things that I think is kind of useful to talk about here is what happens to the spinal cord when it is damaged. So generally, if the spinal cord is damaged from an accident, I'm going to move that picture. There we go. Okay, there we go. That feels better. If the spinal cord is damaged in some way, the outcome is going to depend on where the damage is located. So there are 2 different types of spinal cord injury. The first is what we call an incomplete injury. In this case, a portion of the cord is going to be damaged, and this can potentially produce loss of sensation and motor function only on one side of the body. So it could be ipsilateral damage. So if I damage the left portion of part of my spinal cord, that could potentially damage motor and sensory abilities on my left side. So ipsilateral means on the same side of damage. It could only damage my sensory abilities or only motor damage. So it ultimately depends on the location. A very general rule with spinal cord injury is that the higher up it is, the more debilitating it is. Generally, the lower that it is, like if we're talking about being in the lumbar spine or the sacral spine, that tends to be less debilitating than if we're talking about damage to an area like the cervical spine. So here is kind of an example of this. So I'm sure some of you might be familiar, well, perhaps you are familiar with the disease known as syphilis. It is a sexually transmitted infection. It is curable with penicillin. But if syphilis is left to its own devices, if you don't treat it quickly enough, it can actually damage the dorsal portions of the spinal cord, which are where our sensory inputs are located. So untreated syphilis can result in loss of sensation in parts of the body. Another example is Brown-Séquard syndrome. This is a case where you lose some motor function and some sensory function on the same side of the body as the damage. Again, that's ipsilateral. So if I damage the left spinal cord, ipsilateral damage means it's going to be on the left side. If I damage the right and it's ipsilateral, it will be on the right side as well. Now, a complete injury would be something like this, where I damage both, that I would basically damage sensory and motor loss on both sides of the body. And generally, the higher up the damage is, the more of the body that will be affected. If you have damage right here around the cervical spine, there is a great likelihood that that will develop into quadriplegia. If you're having damage in areas like the lumbar spine or the sacral spine, lower on the spinal cord, that could potentially translate into paraplegia, which is still a problem, but it's not as much of a problem as quadriplegia is. Okay, so that's pretty much what I want you to know for the central nervous system. We are now going to move on and talk about the peripheral nervous system. Does anybody need some more time here? Okay, cool. So just to remind you of these divisions. So our nervous system, we've already covered the central nervous system, which includes both the brain and the spinal cord. We have our peripheral nervous system, which is made up of our spinal nerves that branch out from our spinal cord and the cranial nerves that branch out from the back of the brainstem. Those can be further divided into the autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, which have inputs to glands and internal organs. And then we have our somatic nervous system, sometimes called our skeletal nervous system. And this has inputs to our muscles so that we can move voluntarily, like I'm doing right now, or our sensory organs, like our eyes, our ears, things like that. Everybody good? Okay, no worries. I'll just sit here and bounce around for a second. I'm in the spinny chair. Did anybody go to trivia on Wednesday?
Yes.
Was it fun?
Yeah, it was fun because it was being a bit annoying because it would kick everyone out. But
Oh. Okay, so here are our spinal nerves. So basically, here is the construction of the spinal cord. We have 31 different pairs. Now, in the nerves, so remember that the sensory and the motor portions separate at the roots of the spinal cord, but when they are spinal nerves, they are fused together. So remember, because we're in the peripheral nervous system, these are nerves, not tracts. So they have both sensory and motor axons. So the spinal nerves have both. They are mixed. And we give them letter number names. So we have 8 pairs of nerves in the cervical spine, and you can kind of see that these by and large control portions of the head and the neck. So we have things like the head and the neck, the diaphragm of the stomach, the deltoids, which are kind of shoulders and your biceps, your wrist extenders, and your triceps in your hand. So if you damage right above the cervical spine, you will not be able to use anything from the damage down. If you damage the last of the cervical nerves, you will still have pretty good use of your hands, possibly your biceps, and your head and your neck. For our thoracic nerves, we have about 12. So we call them T1 through 12. We have 8 cervical nerves. We call them C1 through C8. The thoracic nerves largely control the muscles of the chest and the abs. Then we have our lumbar spine. We have about 5 pairs of those. Those are critical for moving the legs. And then we have our sacral nerves. Those largely control the bowel, bladder, and sexual function. That's all I'm going to say. Dr. Gilchrist is prudish. That's as far as we go with that. So you can kind of see why the higher up on the spinal cord that you damage, the more debilitating things become. So if we damage the sacral nerves, well, you could have some issues with the bathroom. Maybe you require a catheter. Maybe you require something like a colostomy bag or something like that. But if you damage things like the thoracic nerves or the lumbar nerves, that means you're not going to be able to move limbs. So generally, the higher up it is, the more extensive the damage is going to be. And folks, I do promise when Plush Gritty shows up, I will bring Plush Gritty to class. but we're not going to spend too much time on plush grading. Okay, everybody good? Let's take a look at a picture. If you do not like looking at potentially gory things, now I know that some of you are bio majors and you're taking anatomy and physiology and you're like, whatever, show me stuff. But just in case, or if you don't like spaghetti, because they kind of look like spaghetti, here's kind of what that looks like. So this is actually a cross section. So here's the spinal cord, here are the nerves. You can kind of see that they branch out like this. Notice that some of the longest nerves that we have in our body run from the lumbar nerve all the way down to the foot. So here's something kind of interesting. Take a look at the nerves that run from around your cervical spine down your arm. How many of you have gotten a paper cut and you feel it right away? Of course you do. The nerves aren't very long there. Now, on the other hand, notice that the nerves that stretch from the lumbar spine down to the end of the foot are the longest nerves that you have in your body. So how many of you have stubbed a toe and you don't even realize that you stubbed it until a few minutes later, or it doesn't really start to hurt until later? Okay, here's a really funny and gross story that I promised I would tell you. So one time when I was in graduate school, I was in my first year, and it was summertime or spring, and I was walking around wearing flip-flops and things like that, talking to somebody on the phone. And I remember hitting the corner of like a little metal grate that was used for kind of a tree planter. And so I'm walking around, and all of a sudden while I'm on the phone, I'm like, I feel like I stepped in something wet. And I look down, and my foot is just covered in blood from where I stubbed my toe, and it still didn't really hurt all that bad. And part of the reason that that happens is that these are some of the longest nerves in the leg, and that doesn't mean that they don't conduct quickly, but it does mean that your sensation there is going to be a little dulled. And in general, you don't really have a lot of sensory receptors in your feet compared to the sensory receptors that you have in your fingers. So oftentimes when you stub your toe, it's going to take a while for you to notice until you're like Dr. G and there's blood gushing all over your foot. Okay, that was my gross story, and I'm sorry if I squeaked you out. Cool. Okay. So now let's very briefly talk about the cranial nerves. Now, if you have me for sensation and perception, or if you're thinking about taking sensation and perception sometime, we talk a little bit more about these in detail. So the cranial nerves, this is a ventral view of the brain, and we've got 12 different pairs of nerves. So we've got one on the right and one on the left. So we have 12 pairs of nerves, just like we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And these are critically for the sensory and motor functions of your head. So if you've ever rolled your eyes at me when I tell a terrible joke, you can thank your cranial nerves. If you have ever tasted something delicious, you can thank your cranial nerves. If you have ever cried when you chop onions, you can thank your cranial nerves. So these contain both sensory and motor fibers. Now, some of these are going to be purely sensory. Some of these are going to be purely motor, but many of them are also mixed. Each is going to supply the somatic system. So a lot of these are for the voluntary movements of things like your eyes, the muscles in your face, and your jaw and your tongue. So anytime that you speak to anybody, your cranial nerves are getting involved and the somatic nervous system is getting involved. Some of these nerves also supply the parasympathetic nervous system. One such example is cranial nerve 10. You don't need to write that down. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the longer nerves in the body, and it has a lot of different outputs to areas like the lungs, the heart, and the stomach. So here's something that's kind of interesting. For those of you that occasionally struggle with anxiety, have you ever heard about the benefits? Have you ever had somebody tell you the benefits of deep belly breathing? So here's why they tell you to do that. So when you breathe in such a way that your stomach extends, the vagus nerve actually has an output to the diaphragm. When you engage your diaphragm, you stimulate the vagus nerve, and that kickstarts the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps slow down your heart rate, and it also facilitates digestion. It's also part of the reason that if anybody punches you really hard in the stomach, sometimes you will pass out. A hard enough hit to the vagus nerve can actually knock you into unconsciousness. So please don't go punching other people's stomachs.
Unless it's necessary.
No, I'm a pacifist. Violence is not necessary. Take it out on a punching bag. Don't hurt anybody. Self-defense is different, I suppose. So these have both numeric names and they have functional names. So for example, I mentioned that cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. So we don't actually name them on the basis of where they are. We kind of name them on the basis of what they're for. So for example, nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. That is for your sense of smell. Number 2 is your optic nerve, which is for your sight. So we have a variety of these different nerves. If you would like a really quick way to remember the names of all of these nerves, here is a helpful mnemonic. On old Olympus's towering tops, a fat Viking guy vents snowy hops. Okay. Olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal accessory, and hypoglossal. On old Olympus's towering tops, a fat Viking guy vents snowy hops. It does make sense. Mnemonics are weird. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about that autonomic nervous system. So if you have ever had an anxiety attack, or if you ever like to engage in sports, thank your autonomic nervous system. Anytime that you are stressed or are exerting yourself, your autonomic nervous system is working. It is largely involuntary. It controls things like your breathing and your heart rate. And I know what you're thinking, Dr. Gilchrist, I can control my breathing. Sure you can. And I bet you can do it right now. But you've been having your breathing happen this whole time without you being aware of it. Do you know how I know that? None of you are dead. Like you're all still here. You've all been breathing at some point, even if you're not physically aware of it or consciously aware of it. The same is true for things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, glucose, blood sugar kind of circulating through your system. So both branches, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, supply the same organs of the body. So one system will increase heart rate. So the sympathetic will increase your heart rate. The parasympathetic will decrease it. The sympathetic nervous system will stop digestion. The parasympathetic will facilitate digestion. It's part of the reason why you really don't exercise after you eat. Don't do it. So the, huh?
I think it's on mute.
Well, and if it doesn't work, if that doesn't happen for you, that's fine. I can tell you that I can ride my exercise bike after I eat, but I sure can't run, and I sure can't lift weights. Like I told you, I tried to do a burpee once, and I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. Like Professor Helminska almost saw me blow chunks. It was bad. Like, please don't tell anybody you saw that almost happen. Okay, and yes, I know it's super scientific of me, blow chunks. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is largely for arousal. And by arousal, I mean that we are getting into a state of alertness and high energy. This is a system that is designed to give our body energy. Things like increasing heart rate, sending extra blood flow to the muscles so they can work, stopping digestion because digestion takes up a lot of energy. And you need that energy to either fight something or run away from something. Now, one of the things that we are going to talk about later on in the semester, probably around April, is that your fight or flight system is not designed for your kind of life. And it sure as heck is not able to deal with the stress of a pandemic that has been going on for a year. So if many of you are feeling burnt out right now, that is largely because your fight or flight system was not designed for long-term events. It was for like, oh man, there's a saber-toothed tiger, we gotta run from it. Like really short-term things. It wasn't, oh no, I've got a semester's class that is really stressing me out. It's not prepared for that.
How about Black Friday sales?
Are we talking about the immediate moment where you might be getting trampled by somebody on Black Friday? Or are we talking about, gotta get somebody that waffle maker and this store didn't have it, so now I gotta find another?
Well, what's the difference?
That's fair. Both are short term, but one is more immediate than the other. Now, on the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system is what is called a vegetative system. It is designed to help you build up your energy after using it again. So it's designed to increase your energy, and it also facilitates digestion, which is part of the reason why your parasympathetic nervous system is called rest and digest. So we've got a fight or flight system and a rest and digest system. I've also heard it referred to as a feed and breathe system, but I don't like that. I like rest and digest. Okay, and generally the actions of the parasympathetic nervous system are in direct opposition to the ones from the sympathetic system. Both of these systems are going to sense things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and sugar in your blood, blood pressure, and the chemical composition of your stomach and your gut content. And that's more true for parasympathetic than for sympathetic. You do not need to know that. I just thought it might be interesting to tell you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each of these systems and what they are for. So one of the first things that you're going to kind of notice is that the sympathetic outputs largely exist in the thoracic and the lumbar spine. Most of the parasympathetic outputs are largely in the cranial nerves and in the sacral spine. So they keep in separate regions of spinal cord. So here are some of the major sympathetic actions. This figure is in your notes, so you don't have to feel like you have to write it all down. So one thing that I will kind of note too is that a lot of the parasympathetic outputs go directly to organs. One of the things you'll kind of notice with the sympathetic outputs is that they will often go to a group of cells first called a ganglion before they go to those target organs. And sometimes they go to glands. So here are some different actions that are taken by the sympathetic nervous system. Your pupils are going to dilate. So one time I had a panic attack at the mall a couple of years ago. I don't really get panic attacks that much anymore. I had a few last year, but generally I've gotten them under control. But a couple of years ago, I was in Joplin and I had one in the mall, and I went and looked in a mirror, and my eyes, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the sympathetic nervous system going, I need to take a breath. So your pupils will dilate, your mouth will become dry, your blood vessels will constrict. So one thing that we will find, if you are prone to anxiety or stress, your blood pressure is going to go up temporarily. Keep that in mind. Your airways are going to relax so that you can get more oxygen into your blood. Your heart rate is going to accelerate. Digestion is going to stop. Glucose release from the gallbladder and the liver is going to start to happen because glucose is your body's biggest source of energy. The adrenal gland is going to release adrenaline. Your bladder is going to contract. So if you get super duper stressed, you might dribble. That's all I'm going to say. And ejaculation will be stimulated in in certain people as well. Okay. Now the parasympathetic nervous system is basically going to be the opposite of that. So the pupils are going to constrict, salivation is going to increase, the airway is going to constrict, heart rate is going to slow, digestion will start again. The gallbladder will stimulate bile to basically break down that glucose. The blood vessels will dilate, the bladder will stimulate, and erection will stimulate in those that are male, or those that are male at birth. Okay, everybody good? So what I think is really important to note here is despite the fact that these are kept in separate sections of spinal cord, the same target organs are involved. And you do not have a lot of control over this stuff. You can't be like, okay, blood vessels, constrict, or okay, digestion, get started, get moving. It doesn't work that way. A lot of this is outside of our control. That was a fun surprise. Did anybody startle at that? I forgot that that was included. So I already kind of mentioned this. So here, yeah, if you see it, I'm amazed that's the face that this person is making, because I would be running. I would not be in that picture. I'd be like, goodbye. On the other hand, now I know that a few people are scared of cats, but I am definitely calmed by my cat. For sure. And other cats, like the cat that hangs out by the softball field. That cat's a cutie. But as I kind of mentioned, you're going to see opposing effects in this case. I've already kind of mentioned these in detail, so I'm not going to stay here very long. So now we're moving on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the neurons and the glial cells. So we're kind of done with the major divisions, but we're about to start to talk about how neurons communicate with each other. So next week's going to be intense and fun. But to be able to do that, we've got to talk a little bit about the neurons and the glial cells. And thankfully, we have some time for that. So there are two types of cells in the nervous system. We have neurons, which are the basic building blocks of our nervous system, and glial cells, which provide a little bit of support. Now, both of these, we have drawings. So here is a pyramidal cell of a neuron. There's that pyramid-shaped cell body. And here we have a glial cell. In this particular case, this is an astrocyte. We call it an astrocyte because it kind of looks like a star. Both of these have been injected with a green fluorescent protein, so we can actually form an image of them more easily. So here is our pyramidal cell. Here are groups of astrocytes. Pyramidal cells, by the way, are about 80% of the neurons that are present in your cortex and in your hippocampus. Fun fact. By the way, one thing I will mention, these are not dendrites. Those are not dendrites. Glial cells do not work that way. Okay, so I'm going to stay on this next slide for a little bit to kind of talk you through it. Okay. Does anybody need some more time here? I can take a sip. I probably should. Plus, people like to watch me drink this through a straw. This has a steel frame. It's kind of hard to drink, put a straw under that. Okay. So I'm going to stay here for a little bit because we've got a lot to unpack here. So there are several parts of a neuron that serve very unique functions. So first of all, we've got our soma, or our cell body. This contains all of the metabolic machinery that you would find in any other animal cell, as well as a nucleus, which houses our DNA, chromosomes, genes, and enzymes, which aid in the production of neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters can be made and packaged within the neurons themselves. By the way, the majority of those neurons that produce neurotransmitters can be found in the brainstem in different regions. So branching off from our cell body, we have our dendrites. Dendrites receive input from other neurons. So you can kind of see here, we have the dendrites of this neuron basically making a connection with the axon of another neuron. Now, one thing that I will mention, this picture makes it look like they're touching. They are not touching. Neurons never touch. They have a gap. You can actually kind of see this word on the slide. It's called a synapse. Now, I've heard of people calling it a synapse. I call it a synapse. So a synapse is a small little gap between our neurons. Now, so then one other thing that I will kind of mention, notice, so we have our axon, and then branching off from our axon is an area called the terminal buttons. Notice that the terminal buttons of this axon are forming a synapse with the dendrites of this neuron. And by the way, since this is recorded, if you're having trouble following this, you can go back and listen to it anytime you want. And if I'm talking too fast, you can stop and rewind it and listen to it again. Or, yeah, you can play the slow rate too. I forgot about that. Nice. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about these synapses. So this synapse that you see here is what we call an axodendritic synapse. And I will write that on the board for you. So it's axo, so it starts on the axon of one, and it ends on the dendrites of another. So it's axo-dendritic. And there it is, axodendritic. So that is the axons of one neuron synapsing on the dendrites of another. So this is what we would call an axodendritic synapse right here. This one, I actually kind of messed up. This one is technically called an axosomatic, and I'll write that down too. So axon, the axon of one neuron and the soma of another. So we have axodendritic, axosomatic, and then there's one that is not here, and you don't need to write it down. We actually have one called dendrodendritic. Two dendrites making contact with each other.
And what does that do?
I don't know. Like dendrodendritic is actually pretty rare, just because in that instance, you aren't really releasing neurotransmitters in that instance. So one of the things that you're going to notice when we're naming a synapse, the first one that is named is what we call a presynaptic neuron. It is occurring before the synapse. Do you need me to write that down too? I can. All right. So we have presynaptic. So the first one that we mention is presynaptic. So when we have an axodendritic, the axon is our presynaptic neuron. And then the second one is what we call postsynaptic. You're going to hear me use the terms presynaptic and postsynaptic a lot. So one other thing that I will mention is that communication is unidirectional. It moves in one direction. It starts at the presynaptic neuron and it always goes to the postsynaptic neuron. It does not go backwards. And we'll talk about why it doesn't go backwards later on. So the axon, as you can kind of see here, is a long process that branches off of the cell body And this is what carries an electrical signal between the cell body of one neuron all the way to the synapse. Now this portion right here, the top portion of the axon, is called an axon hillock. That's hillock is H-I-L-L-O-C-K, hillock. So that's this area right here. This is the axon hillock. That's where the cell body ends and the axon begins. The axon hillock is going to play a pretty big role in transmitting information down the axon, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Most of the axons, but not all of them, are going to be covered with this fatty substance called myelin. That allows electrical transmission down the axon to occur much more quickly. And we'll talk about why, probably not today, but next week. Does anybody have any questions? Really quick, I think I've got a piece of fuzz on my mask near my nose. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about information flow within a neuron, here's what it kind of looks like. So here's what we're going to be talking about, what this information is. That's what we'll do next week. So generally what we're going to find, information usually comes from axons from other neurons, which you can see here, and then they branch on and synapse with dendrites. So information from other neurons is going to be connected by the dendrites. And by the way, one thing that you'll kind of notice that there are a lot of different axons making contact with many different dendrites. We have a lot of different connections here. Information is going to be collected at the dendrites. The cell body is going to process those. Then what we are going to find is that that is going to be passed on down the axon down to the terminal buttons. Here they're called end feet, which I think is kind of cute. And then that information will eventually be passed on to a postsynaptic neuron. So information flow, we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. Information flow is unidirectional. So it flows in one direction from the dendrites to the cell body to the axon. There is no back propagation. It does not go backwards ever. And we'll talk about why it doesn't go backwards. And don't ask me if it ever has. It hasn't. It can't.
How do you know?
Huh?
How do you know?
Ions. And I'll explain why. Ion channels. We have what's called a refractory period. And during those times, because the refractory period is certainly long enough, the ions aren't going to be able to flow backwards. It's just not going to happen. But that's a good question. I always welcome a challenge. And most of the time when you do challenge me, I'll be like, I have to look that up. But in this case, I am absolutely certain. And I'm not certain about a lot of things. Okay, so does anybody need some more time here? Thanks for sticking it out. We only have 4 minutes left. Is this your last class of the day?
Yes.
Cool, you get to enjoy your day next. If it isn't, you got band.
That's happened.
Yeah, band's gonna be fun. I always like to end my day with playing music. I like being a glorified cover band. It's great. That's what band is. You're basically covering other people's work. Okay, so we'll end on this slide. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the functional classification of neurons, what different neurons do. And then starting on Monday, we're going to talk about the structural classifications. So there are 3 major types of neurons in terms of function. So we have sensory neurons, we have interneurons, and we have motor neurons. So sensory neurons, their job is to basically take information from different tissues like our skin and our eyes and our ears, and basically pass that on to the brain and the spinal cord. So here, for example, this is the beginning of a very terrifying thing. After this first exam, we're going to talk about vision. We're going to spend a lot of time about on bipolar neurons, and you are not going to like me. You're like, I like you. Yeah, wait until we talk about on and off cells. I promise. You may not like me then. Okay, so the bipolar neuron, which can be found in the retina. Here we have a somatosensory neuron, which can be present in the skin and muscle. Kind of notice that we have a dendrite, we have a cell body, and we kind of have an axon. These are designed to bring information into the central nervous system. We sometimes call these afferent neurons because afferent means we're going to the brain, like we talked about last time with afferent fibers. We have our inner neurons, which are designed to communicate with other neurons. They can also associate sensory and motor activity within the central nervous system. These are located in organs and tissues. These are located entirely within the brain and the spinal cord. So inner neurons are located entirely within the brain and spinal cord. So that'll include things like an association cell that you might find in the thalamus, and all of these are dendrites. Here we have a pyramidal cell, which can be found in the cortex, and a Purkinje cell, or sometimes called a Purkinje cell, which can be found in the cerebellum. And I think Purkinje cells are actually really cool looking. Look at those dendrites. I like that. And then finally, we have our motor neurons. These send signals from the brain and spinal cord to our muscles so that our muscles can move. So you can kind of see that they all look a little bit different. We sometimes call these efferent neurons because they come from the brain. So folks, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We will finish talking about neurons and glial cells. We'll talk about how some cells in the central nervous system might be able to regenerate. And then we'll start talking about how neurons communicate with each other. Have a wonderful weekend. I will set up a review session with you on Monday. Make good choices. Don't lick doorknobs. And I will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye, Dr. G.